Imagine this. You're completely cut off, maybe trapped somewhere, and suddenly you just can't take another breath. It's terrifying, right? Just a few short minutes without oxygen, and, well, it's over.
It really is the most urgent, the most non-negotiable exchange any living thing has with its environment. Absolutely critical.
And yet you see these incredible examples in nature, like those stunning Christmas tree worms on coral reefs, or maybe something like the ingenious diving beetle. They seem to handle this whole breathing challenge with, well, amazing grace.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this fascinating world of how animals manage these absolutely vital exchanges, getting oxygen in, getting carbon dioxide out.
Right. And for this deep dive, we're drawing heavily from that classic text, Animal Physiology by Hill, Wyse, and Anderson, a really comprehensive source.
Is. Our mission really is to unpack the core physiological ideas, the clever mechanisms animals use, the systems involved. We'll look at some really neat comparative strategies, why they matter for survival, their adaptive significance, and uncover some surprising scientific principles along the way.
And the urgency, going back to that, it really can't be stressed enough. For humans, just a handful of minutes without O2 and that's it. And the big why, the core reason, is oxygen's role, right? That final electron acceptor in cellular respiration.
Absolutely fundamental. It's essential for making ATP, the energy currency our cells absolutely run on. Without oxygen catching those electrons at the end of the chain, the whole metabolic engine just grinds to a halt.
So getting O2 in is paramount. But getting CO2 out is just as critical, isn't it?
Equally vital, yes. If carbon dioxide builds up inside the body, it quickly makes body fluids more acidic. And that acidification can cause a whole cascade of problems throughout the system. It disrupts enzymes, protein function, everything.
So it's this constant balancing act. Get enough oxygen, ditch the CO2 efficiently.
That's the game.
Okay, so how do these gases actually move? What are the sort of fundamental rules governing their transport?
Well, there are really two main ways respiratory gases move. One is simple diffusion, just molecules spreading out. The other is convection, which we also call bulk flow, moving fluids carrying the gases.
Convection-like, breathing air in or blood pumping?
Exactly. Now, what's really crucial here, and sometimes a bit counterintuitive, is how oxygen moves. Oxygen only moves by passive transport.
Passive, so the animal doesn't expend any direct energy, any ATP, to move oxygen molecules across membranes.
Precisely. None at all for the oxygen movement itself. It always moves passively, just following its gradient, moving from an area where its tendency to move is high towards an area where it's lower, always aiming for equilibrium.
Okay, that's key. Oxygen is always passive. What about CO2?
CO2 is a bit different. It can sometimes be actively transported, often indirectly. Because it reacts with water to form bicarbonate ions, those ions can then be moved using energy, which ultimately facilitates CO2 transport across membranes. But oxygen, strictly passive.
Wow, okay. So, let's see, this passive O2 uptake in action. You mentioned those coral reef worms, the Christmas tree worm.
Phyrobranchus, yeah.
Yeah.
They're beautiful. They live in tubes in the coral, and they stick out these amazing feathery structures that look just like little pine trees.
And those are their gills.
Essentially, yes. Highly branched, very thin surfaces packed with blood vessels containing a hemoglobin-like pigment. They just sit there, projecting into the water.
So the oxygen just diffuses from the water across those thin surfaces and into the blood.
Exactly. Passively. Down its gradient, straight into the blood, which then circulates it around the worm's body. It's a really elegant example of diffusion at work.
Okay, but the diving beetle example you mentioned, that sounds like where things get really interesting with this passive transport idea.
They grab an air bubble, right?
They do. They come to the surface, trap a bubble of air under their wing covers, and take it down with them. Most people think of it just as a little scuba tank.
Which it is, partly. Partly, yes. But here's the amazing part. That bubble isn't just an air supply. It actually functions as a physical gill while the beetle is underwater.
A gill? How?
As the beetle uses up oxygen from the bubble, the oxygen level inside it drops, but the water around it still contains dissolved oxygen. So oxygen from the surrounding water continuously diffuses into the bubble.
Across the surface of the bubble.
Across the bubble's air-water interface, exactly. And then from the bubble, that oxygen moves into the beetle's own respiratory system, its network of air tubes called tracheae. This bubble gill often provides way more oxygen than was initially in the bubble itself. It's a fantastic adaptation.
But hang on, if the water generally has a much lower concentration of oxygen than air does, why would oxygen move from the low concentration water into the higher concentration bubble? That seems backward for diffusion.
And that is the perfect question. This is the aha moment. It forces us to think beyond simple concentration when dealing with gases moving between different phases, like air and water.
So concentration isn't the whole story for gases.
Not when they're moving between, say, air and water, or air and blood.
Yeah.
For solutes dissolved in water, like sugar or salt, yes, diffusion generally follows the concentration gradient, high concentration to low concentration. But for gases, the real driving force is something called chemical potential.
Chemical potential. Okay, what's that in practical terms?
For physiologists working with gases, the practical direct measure of chemical potential is partial pressure. Gases always diffuse from an area of high partial pressure to an area of low partial pressure. Always. It doesn't matter if it's within a gas mixture, within a liquid, or across the boundary between them. Partial pressure rules.
Okay, so let's break down partial pressure. Starting with just gases in the air, like the air we're reading now.
Right. This goes back to John Dalton and his law of partial pressures. It's pretty straightforward. The total pressure of a gas mixture is just the sum of the pressures that each individual gas would exert if it were alone in that same volume.
So for air, which is about 21% oxygen.
Roughly, yeah. About 20.95% oxygen, 78% nitrogen, tiny bit of CO2, and others. If the total atmospheric pressure is 1 atmosphere, then the partial pressure of oxygen, the PO2, is simply 0.2095 times 1 atmosphere, so about 0.21 atmospheres. Same logic for nitrogen, its partial pressure is about 0.78 atmospheres.
And within the air itself, partial pressure and concentration are linked.
Directly proportional, yes. At a given temperature, if you double the partial pressure of oxygen in the air, you've doubled its concentration. Simple relationship within a single gas phase.
Got it. But now what about gases dissolved in liquids like water or our blood? When a gas dissolves, it sort of disappears, right? No bubbles unless it's not dissolved.
Exactly. It disperses molecule by molecule. Now, the partial pressure of a gas in a solution is defined relative to the gas phase. It's equal to the partial pressure of that same gas in an air pocket, or gas phase, with which the solution is at equilibrium.
Meaning, if you leave water sitting out, exposed to air with a PO2 of 0.21 at Angira,
oxygen will dissolve into the water until the partial pressure of oxygen in the water also reaches 0.21 at EVA. At that point, the rates of oxygen molecules entering and leaving the water are equal. Equilibrium.
And how much actually dissolves depends on the gas, right? Some gases dissolve better than others.
Hugely different. This is described by Henry's law, and we talk about the absorption coefficient, or solubility. There are 3 really key things to remember about gas solubility in water. First, different gases have vastly different solubilities. CO2 is a prime example. It's way, way more soluble in water than oxygen or nitrogen are.
How much more soluble?
Oh, maybe 25, 30 times more soluble than oxygen at the same temperature and partial pressure. You can pack a lot more CO2 into water.
Okay, that's point 1. What else?
Second, temperature has a big effect. Gas solubilities in water decrease strongly as temperature goes up.
Like when you leave a glass of cold water out and bubbles form as it warms up?
Precisely. The water can't hold as much dissolved gas when it's warmer, so the gases come out of solution. For oxygen, its solubility roughly halves between freezing point 0 degrees C and mammalian body temperature, around 37-40 degrees C.
That's a significant drop. And the third point?
Salinity. Solutes dissolved in the water, like salts in seawater, reduce the solubility of gases. It's called the salting out effect. So oxygen is less soluble in seawater than in fresh water at the same temperature.
Okay, different solubilities, decreases with heat, decreases with salt.
Got it.
These factors together have huge consequences for aquatic animals trying to get oxygen.
Right. So let's loop back to that diving beetle and the partial pressure thing. You said oxygen moves from the water into the bubble even if the water has a lower O2 concentration. How does partial pressure explain that?
Okay, this is where it clicks. Let's say the pond water is in equilibrium with the air above it, so the PO2 in the water is 0.21 at ANM. But because oxygen isn't very soluble, the actual concentration of O2 molecules in that water is quite low, maybe 0.3 millimoles per liter. Okay, low concentration but high partial pressure, 0.21 at AM.
Exactly. Now, the beetle takes its bubble down. Let's say it uses up some oxygen, so the PO2 inside the bubble drops maybe to 0.1 at ADM. But because air itself is rich in oxygen molecules, the concentration of O2 inside that bubble might still be quite high, say 4.3 millimoles per liter, much higher than the water's concentration.
Ah, so the water has PO2 0.21 at atm and concentration equals 0.3 millimole. The bubble has PO2 equals 0.1 at atm, but concentration equals 4.3 millimole.
Precisely. And since diffusion follows the partial pressure gradient, oxygen moves from the high partial pressure water, 0.21 at atm, into the low partial pressure bubble, zero point 0.1 at atm.
Even though it's moving from low concentration water to high concentration bubble.
That's the key insight. It perfectly shows why partial pressure is the universal driver for gas diffusion across phases. The bubble truly acts as a physical gill, constantly drawing oxygen from the water, all thanks to partial pressure gradients.
That's a fantastic example, and understanding partial pressure is also critical for things like decompression sickness in divers.
Absolutely. When a diver goes deep, the pressure around them increases significantly. Say, at 30 meters, the pressure is 4 times surface pressure.
So the partial pressure of all the gases in the air they breathe goes up fourfold.
Exactly, including nitrogen. If the diver stays down long enough, the nitrogen partial pressure in their blood and tissues equilibrates with that high ambient partial pressure. Now, the danger comes during ascent.
If they come up too fast.
Right. The external pressure drops quickly. Suddenly, the nitrogen dissolved in their tissues is at a much higher partial pressure than the surrounding pressure or any tiny gas nuclei that might be present. It's like uncapping a soda bottle the dissolved gas wants out fast.
And it forms bubbles in the blood and tissues, the bends.
Exactly. Macroscopic, damaging bubbles that can block blood flow, pinch nerves. It's very dangerous. And dolphins, which make incredible deep dives, have evolved physiological mechanisms to cope with similar N2 pressure issues.
So the rate of diffusion also depends on this partial pressure difference, but also on the distance, right?
Yes, the rate is proportional to the difference in partial pressure, P1, P2, and inversely proportional to the distance x the gas has to travel. There's also a factor K, the Crow diffusion coefficient, which depends on the gas and the medium it's diffusing through.
And this brings up another massive difference, air versus water. You said gases diffuse much faster in air.
Oh, enormously faster. Oxygen diffuses something like 200,000 times faster in air than in water. Carbon dioxide, about 9,000 times faster. It's a huge difference.
Wow. 200,000 times. What are the implications of that?
Profound implications. Think about sea turtle eggs buried in sand. If the sand is dry, air fills the pores, and oxygen diffuses easily down to the eggs. But if that nest gets waterlogged,
the diffusion path becomes water instead of air.
Right, and suddenly, oxygen diffusion slows to a crawl. The partial pressure down by the eggs can plummet to zero, and the embryos suffocate. Same idea for animals in burrows like prairie dogs. They rely on those air-filled tunnels for oxygen delivery deep underground.
And this massive difference in diffusion rates led to a famous discovery, right? Crow's 1 millimeter rule.
Yes. August Crow did the calculations and experiments. He realized that because diffusion through water or tissues is so slow, it can only supply enough oxygen to meet metabolic needs over very, very short distances, typically 1 millimeter or less.
1 millimeter, that's tiny.
It is. This has huge implications. Tiny animals or larval stages might rely entirely on diffusion across their body surface, but only if they stay small. Think of larval fish. As they grow, they quickly reach a size where diffusion alone isn't enough, and they need gills and circulation.
And in humans.
Critically important. Think about our lungs. The barrier between air and blood is incredibly thin for a reason. If fluid builds up in the lungs, like in pneumonia or edema, even a small increase in that diffusion distance drastically impairs oxygen uptake. It becomes a medical emergency very quickly because of that 1 millimeter limit.
This is where something like hemoglobin in our blood becomes so important, isn't it? How does it help with this diffusion problem?
It's ingenious. When oxygen diffuses from the lungs into the blood, it quickly binds chemically to hemoglobin molecules inside red blood cells. Crucially, oxygen bound to hemoglobin does not contribute to the partial pressure of oxygen dissolved in the blood plasma.
Ah, so only the free dissolved O2 counts towards the PO2 in the blood.
Exactly. So as O2 diffuses in, it binds to hemoglobin, effectively disappearing from the dissolved pool. This keeps the PO2 in the blood plasma low, right near the lung interface.
Maintaining a steep partial pressure gradient from the air into the blood.
Precisely. It maintains the driving force for diffusion. Hemoglobin acts like a sink, constantly pulling oxygen across the membrane by binding it up, allowing continuous, efficient uptake, even though blood itself can't dissolve that much O2 on its own.
Okay, so diffusion works great over short distances, especially with tricks like hemoglobin. But for larger animals, moving oxygen from, say, the lungs to a toe, diffusion is way too slow.
Absolutely impossible by diffusion alone. The distances are far too great. That's where the other mechanism, convection, becomes essential, the long-haul solution.
Remind us what convection is again.
Convection, or bulk flow, is simply the movement of the respiratory gas when it's carried along by a flowing fluid. That fluid could be air moving into the lungs when we breathe, or water flowing over gills, or blood circulating through the body.
And it's much faster than diffusion over these long distances.
Far, far faster. It involves actively moving large volumes of the fluid, which carries the gas along with it. Of course, this requires energy using muscles for breathing, using the heart muscle to pump blood. But it's the only way to bridge those large gaps between the environment and the cells deep inside.
You mentioned prairie dogs using wind for convection in their burrows. That's pretty neat, getting a free ride.
It is. Natural convection using ambient winds or water currents can definitely help. Prairie dogs engineer their burrow entrances at different heights on mounds. Wind blowing across the mounds creates slight pressure differences, Bernoulli's principle, which drives airflow through the entire burrow system. Free ventilation.
Clever. So, for active animals like us, how do we maximize this convective transport?
The rate of convective gas transport depends on two things: the total concentration of the gas in the fluid, including bound gas like O2 on hemoglobin, and the flow rate of the fluid.
So more gas per liter of fluid and more liters flowing per minute.
Exactly. And mammals, birds, active animals, we've maximized both. We have high concentrations of hemoglobin, allowing our blood to carry vastly more oxygen than could simply be dissolved. And we have powerful hearts, capable of pumping blood at very high rates, especially during exercise. High concentration times high flow equals massive oxygen delivery via convection.
This leads us perfectly to the grand strategy: the combination, the alternation of convection and diffusion.
That's the key for most complex animals.
Mhm.
Neither process alone is sufficient. Diffusion is great for short distances across membranes, but terrible for long distances. Convection is great for long distances, but you still need diffusion at the beginning and end of the journey to get the gas across the exchange surfaces and into the final target cells.
So they work in tandem, like a relay.
A multi-step relay race is a perfect analogy. Convection covers the long laps, diffusion handles the baton passes at the start and finish lines.
Okay, let's unpack this. Walk us through the human oxygen cascade. Take an oxygen molecule from the air outside all the way to a mitochondrion deep inside a muscle cell, step by step.
All right. Step 1, from the atmosphere into the deep air sacs alveoli of your lungs. That's convection breathing. Moving air maybe half a meter.
Okay, bulk flow of air.
Step 2, from the air in the alveoli, cross the extremely thin lung epithelium and capillary wall into the blood. That's diffusion. A tiny distance, less than a micron.
Diffusion across the gas exchange surface.
Step 3, from the lungs, carried by the blood, all the way to, say, a capillary near your bicep muscle. That's convection, again, blood circulation. Cover maybe a meter or so.
Bulk flow of blood.
Step 4, from the blood plasma in that capillary, across the capillary wall, through the interstitial fluid, across the muscle cell membrane, and finally into a mitochondrion inside that cell. That's all diffusion again. Another very short microscopic journey.
Convection diffusion. Wow.
And this whole pathway is what we call the oxygen cascade.
Yeah.
You can picture it like water flowing downhill over a series of waterfalls.
Why a cascade?
Because at each step in this transport chain, the partial pressure of oxygen must decrease. Remember, oxygen only moves passively down its partial pressure gradient. So the PO2 in the air is highest, it drops in the alveoli, drops again in the arterial blood, drops further in the capillaries, and is lowest at the mitochondrion where it's being consumed.
The whole system is designed to ensure that even after all those drops, the PO2 arriving at the mitochondria is still high enough to keep cellular respiration going.
Exactly. It's an incredibly elegant, efficient system shaped by physics and evolution.
Now, to really wrap our heads around the strategies, we have to consider the huge differences between air and water as places to live and breathe.
They're profoundly different environments for gas exchange. First, think about density and viscosity. Water is about 800 times denser than air, and it's 35 to maybe 100 times more viscous, depending on temperature.
So it's just physically harder to move water around.
Much harder. It takes significantly more energy to pump water over gills than it does to move air into lungs. We see this reflected in metabolic cost. A fish might spend 10% or more of its total energy budget just on ventilation. For us, breathing normally is maybe only 1–2%. Water breathing is energetically expensive.
And then there's the actual amount of oxygen available. This is pretty surprising, right?
It's a massive difference. Even when fully saturated with air at sea level, Water holds only about 5% or less of the oxygen concentration found in the same volume of air.
Only 5%.
Or less. Think about it. To get 1 liter of pure oxygen, an animal breathing air needs to process maybe 5 liters of air. To get that same liter of oxygen from cold, fresh water, it needs to process almost 100 liters of water. And from warmer seawater, maybe 125 liters or more.
Wow. So water breathers have to work much harder to move the fluid, and they get much less oxygen reward for their effort.
Precisely. High cost, low reward, relatively speaking. This combination is a major reason why the animals with the highest metabolic rates, think birds, mammals, insects, are all air breathers. It's just far easier to sustain high activity levels when you can get oxygen easily from the air.
And the stability of these gases varies a lot between environments, too.
Absolutely. Local conditions are constantly being shaped by biological activity, photosynthesis producing O2, respiration consuming O2 and producing CO2, and by physical processes like diffusion and currents mixing things up.
So open air is pretty stable.
Generally, yes. On land, away from high altitudes, O2 and CO2 levels in the open air are quite constant. But secluded places, like those animal burrows or even dense soil, can see significant O2 depletion and CO2 buildup because exchange with the wider atmosphere is limited.
And water is even more variable.
Much more prone to variation. Because mixing is slower in water and diffusion is so much slower, local biological activity can have a huge impact. It's common to find aquatic environments, especially near sediments or in stagnant areas, where oxygen levels become very low, hypoxic, or even drop to zero, anoxic, even if the surface water is fine.
So pulling all this together from our deep dive today, what really stands out? For me, it's that incredible interplay between simple physics and biological adaptation.
I completely agree. The absolute reliance on passive transport for oxygen, no energy spent directly moving it. The crucial, sometimes really counterintuitive importance of partial pressure over concentration. And then this elegant alternation of bulk flow convection and short hop diffusion to make it all work in complex animals. It really is a testament to the power of evolution finding solutions within physical constraints.
It really paints a picture of this delicate balance that animals maintain just to keep breathing second by second. And it makes you think, doesn't it? How might environmental changes like, say, ocean warming, which we know decreases oxygen solubility, how might that impact aquatic life?
It puts huge pressure on them. Less oxygen available, potentially higher metabolic demands if their temperature rises.
Yeah.
It stresses that whole system we've been talking about.
Yeah, even seemingly small changes in these basic physical properties of water or air can create massive survival challenges. It really highlights how interconnected physiology and the environment are.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of animal gas exchange. We hope you've picked up some new insights and maybe a fresh appreciation for all the incredible unseen work happening inside every living creature just to keep things going.